Hello again, welcome to Introduction to Experimental Psychology, Psych 224. This is session 10 of this course. So in the previous session, which is section 10, part 1, I talked about the ethical guidelines concerning the use of human participants in research. For this session, which is session 10, part 2 and 3, I'll talk about ethical guidelines governing the use of animal subjects in research, and then I'll talk briefly about scientific misconduct. So in as much as we have guidelines for the use of human participants in research, we also have the same for animal subjects. And I'm sure in your previous studies in psychology, in your previous levels, you've learned about how animals have played a major role in the development of the field of psychology. So for instance, you have classical conditioning that was generated as a result of experimentation with a dog, etc. So in the past, animals were used in experimentation. However, there was a long-standing debate about the unethical use of animals in experimentation. So besides talking about these guidelines, I'll also talk about what is termed scientific misconduct. So besides these guidelines, psychologists in their research activities, whether designing a study, writing a research report, conducting a study, etc., they are supposed to avoid scientific misconduct. So I'll also talk about scientific misconduct. So by the end of this session, you should be able to explain how animal ethics came about. That will be very brief. You should be able to outline and explain the APA ethical guidelines governing the use of animal subjects in research. And then you should be able to define what scientific misconduct is and explain the 3 components that make up scientific misconduct. So I'll talk about why ethical concerns in animal research. And then I'll talk about the guidelines. Then I'll talk about scientific misconduct. And this is your reading list. So why ethical concerns in animal research? I've mentioned earlier that the use of animals have played an important role in the development of the field of psychology, most especially in the development of theories. So I gave an example as Pavlov. There's also Thorndike, and there's also Skinner. They all use animals, and many more who use animals in their experimentation. And it's based on that various theories have been developed. So animals are used in experimentation for several reasons. Sometimes it's because we may not be able to manipulate certain variables in humans. If we do that, it is unethical. That is why we will study animals. I'm sure in your level 100, you have studied why the use of animals in research or in psychological research. So I won't go into details about that. Unfortunately, although the use of animals have played a major role in the development of the field of psychology, there had always been a long-standing debate about the use of animals in experimentation, because some people believe that these animals that were being tested were not being treated humanely. Others also believe that, well, they are animals, and so we just use them for experimentation without thinking about the harm that is being caused to the animals, etc., etc. So there were one group of people who thought the use of animals is beneficial to society, so let's just go ahead. Another group who thought that the rights of the animals were being violated. So as a result of that, in the 1970s and early 1980s, we had animal rights groups emerging. And these are some of the animal rights groups that emerged. And based on that, we had the ethical guidelines governing the use of animal participants, animal subjects in research. So the APA guidelines specifies how animals should be treated how they should be housed, and how they should be disposed of after they have been used in experimentation. So the guidelines I'm going to talk to you about is informed by Section 8.09 of the Ethical Principles of Psychologists and Code of Conduct, APA 2010. So I'm going to go on to talk about the ethical guidelines. The first is justification of research. So according to the guidelines, researchers should use animals in experimentation only when they can justify that it has a scientific purpose. So, and also, they should be able to show that this study will be done in order to understand behavior. They should be able to show that in studying the animals, it will increase the knowledge and understanding of the particular species that is being studied among others. So, the species that is being used should be one that will help to answer the research question. So don't have a research proposal that intends to study, let's say, pigeons, and because you can't obtain pigeons, you go and get guinea pigs. Whatever species you study should be one that will best answer your research questions. And again, this guideline says that psychologists should consider alternative ways that will minimize the number of animals that they will be testing. So if you propose to test 30 animals, however, testing 20 animals will give you just about the same results, you rather look to minimizing the number and using 20 instead of 30. And again, your research protocol must be reviewed by what is called the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. In the previous section when I talked about institutional approval, if you remember, when I listed the various ethics committee at the University of Ghana, the first one was the Noguchi one, which was an Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. The second guideline talks about the personnel that are involved in the research. So the psychologist, who is the main investigator in the research, should ensure that all the personnel that are involved in the study, because sometimes you have what you call research assistants who will help you in your research. So all these individuals involved in the study should have knowledge about these ethical guidelines. So the psychologists and their assistants should be aware of the behavioral characteristics of the species that they are studying. You should know about the behavior of that particular species so that if that species puts up an abnormal behavior, you can detect it and know that this is an unusual behavior. Again, the psychologist is supposed to ensure that all the personnel who are involved in the research are well informed about the ethical methods that are used in the care and maintenance and the handling of these animals that are being studied. And again, for the personnel, their activities should match up to their competence. So you need to train them. Sometimes you may have personnel that have more experience than the other. So based on their competence, you assign them their roles in the research. The third guideline has to do with the care and housing of laboratory animals. So the psychological well-being of the animals may vary depending on the species that is involved in the study. So usually the APA doesn't specify or doesn't give specific guidelines as to the care and housing of laboratory animals. Instead, what this guideline suggests is that psychologists familiar with certain species should ensure that they enrich the environment of these species in order to develop the psychological well-being of those species. So know the species you are studying, know their behavior, know how you'll be able to enrich their environment for their psychological well-being. Also, in the care and housing of animals, you notice that I've put asterisks on the first point on the slide because this is specific to the United States. Remember, these guidelines are the APA guidelines. So I'm sure from country to country, this may vary. So in terms of facilities that house animals, they should conform to whatever guidelines that whichever country you are in subscribes to. And here it says that the facilities that house the animals should conform to the U.S. Department of Agricultural guidelines. And these facilities should be inspected twice in a year. As I said, this is specific to the United States, so I'm sure it will vary from country to country. Again, the research should be reviewed by an institutional board to give the approval for the research to be conducted. The other guideline has to do with the acquisition of laboratory animals. This guideline says that the animals should be lawfully acquired from a qualified supplier. So make sure that if you are testing animals, you obtain them from a qualified supplier. Not just stand by the roadside and buy some pigeons or some puppies, etc., and go and study them. That is wrong. And if you have to transport the animals from where you bought them to the laboratory, the guideline says that the transporter should provide the animals with adequate food, there should be good ventilation, they should be provided with water, etc., etc. So basically, the animals that are being transported to the lab for experimentation should not be put under due stress. Again, in acquiring the animals, when the animals are being taken from the wild, they should be trapped in a humane manner. And where you are studying endangered species, you make sure that you do so with permission and ethical consent. The fifth ethical guideline has to do with experimental procedures. So it says that the humane treatment of animals should be integrated in the design and conduct of the procedure. So right from when you are designing your animal research up to when you collect your data, you have to incorporate into your procedure the humane treatment of the animals. So if, for instance, where you will keep them when you transport them to the lab, you have to make sure that it's a place where it's well ventilated, they are well fed, etc., etc. Just basically making sure that you treat the animals in a humane manner. A lot of times when I talk about these guidelines, students will laugh because they don't see the need of treating the animals humanely. But that is the ethical guidelines, and if you go against it, it can affect you as a psychologist. Again, the psychologist should also adhere to these guidelines. They should use alternative procedures that will minimize discomfort, illness, and pain to the animal. So what the guideline actually says is that sometimes when you are conducting the study, perhaps as a psychologist, you should try the procedure on yourself. And if you think that is too much for you, you probably will have to reduce whatever procedure it is for the animals. So you minimize the discomfort. So for instance, if you are going to administer electric shock and you think that it will be too high, you try and minimize it if that will still answer your research question. Where you have to use surgical procedures, so perhaps you have to dissect the animal, etc., this must be supervised by persons that are competent in the use of surgical procedures. And then finally, if you've used the animals, perhaps you've injected them with some chemicals and therefore it's not good for them to still be alive or to keep them alive, and you have to terminate the life of the animal, you have to use euthanasia. So, and when you do that, do it in a humane manner to ensure immediate death. So don't go and take a blunt knife and put it to the neck of the animal. If you can inject them with some form of injection that would ensure immediate death, you do so to minimize the discomfort and the pain for the animal. Then we have field research. So with field research, it talks about the fact, this guideline talks about the fact that field research must receive ethics approval, and also the fact that the researcher has to ensure that there's no damage to the sensitive ecosystem and the community. So imagine you are studying animals, you are doing observations, you are doing some manipulations. You have to ensure that whatever you do, it doesn't damage the environment in which the animals live in. And there should also be very little disturbance to the population that are around. So as much as possible, you minimize the potential harm or effects on the population that is being studied. So in terms of whatever species you are studying, you have to make sure that it does, whatever observations you are making doesn't affect the other animal population that are around. Then again, the privacy and property of humans in the habitat where you are doing the observations should also be respected and protected as well. So you protect the whole population of animals that you are studying, as well as protect humans who may live around the area where you are conducting your study. And the study should ensure that if you are using an endangered species, you are able to specify why you have to study endangered species, and you should obtain ethics approval to study these endangered species, because remember, these endangered species are species that are being extinct. Then finally, we have educational use of animals, also as part of the ethical guidelines. And basically what this guideline says is that instructions and discussions of ethics and the value of animal research should be encouraged in relevant courses. So just as I'm teaching you about ethics concerning the use of animals in research. These kind of talks should be encouraged in relevant courses. Courses that involve studying about animals and animal research. It's important that instructors, for instance, will talk about ethical guidelines, etc. And where animals have to be used for educational purposes, you do so only after reviewing whatever planned use this is for. So for instance, if you have to teach your students about the fact that there are some organs in some animals that are similar to humans, you want to dissect the animal and actually show the students about it. This guideline says that where possible, if there's a video that is on dissecting this particular species, rather use the videotape to teach the students rather than going to get an animal to dissect, etc. So look for non-animal alternatives when you have to use animals for educational purposes. So that brings us to the end of the ethical guidelines for the use of animals in research. I mentioned that I'll also talk about scientific misconduct. So very briefly, let me talk about scientific misconduct. So the U.S. Office of the Science and Technology Policy defines research misconduct or scientific misconduct as fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism in proposing, performing, reviewing research, or reporting research results. So it has to do with when, for instance, researchers fabricate data, or when they falsify data, or when they plagiarize when they are designing and conducting their research. So I'll briefly talk about each of these. So fabrication is misrepresenting research results by making up the data. So as the name suggests, you fabricate the data. So sometimes, let's say you want to conduct a study, you're doing a survey and you want to test 100 students, and then you are able to get only 70 students, but you propose to test 100. So rather than persisting to get the 30 more students, you sit in your room as a student and then you take the questionnaires, you put in some fake names, and then you just take in anything and pretend as if it's another participant completing the questionnaire. So you fake the results, or you fake the data, or you make up the data for the rest of the 30 participants that you are finding difficulty to obtain. This is wrong. This is termed as scientific misconduct. Because what happens is that whatever findings you come up with, whatever results that you come up with, may not be a true reflection of perhaps what people's opinion are about whatever phenomenon that you are investigating. So individuals are deceived about the outcome of the study. So the second one is falsification, which is manipulating research materials, equipment, or processes, or changing or omitting data or results such that the research is not accurately represented in the research records. So sometimes what researchers do is that they will delete data just to be able to confirm their hypothesis, or they will add more to it. So just falsifying whatever information that they obtain, and this again results in scientific misconduct. If they feel that, for instance, the hypothesis say that younger people will have a more positive perception towards same-sex relationship, and they find out that out of the 50 they tested, 20 of them were showing a negative attitude, the researcher may say that, well, this is not confirming my hypothesis, so they omit the 20 participants and their responses. Here you have falsified the data by omitting some aspect of it, and that is tantamount to scientific misconduct. Then the third and final one is plagiarism. So plagiarism ranges from the unreferenced use of others' published or unpublished ideas, including research grant applications, to submission under a new authorship, to a complete paper, sometimes in a different language. It may occur at any stage of planning, research, writing, or publication. It applies to print and electronic version. Now, what this quote means is basically, if, for instance, you take someone's research proposal and claim it to be yours, that is plagiarism. If you take someone's procedure that was used in an experiment and claim it to be yours and do not acknowledge that you actually took this information from somewhere else, it is plagiarism. So basically, plagiarism is referred to as academic theft. It is the appropriation of another person's idea, processes, results, etc., without giving the appropriate credit. So you take the information as if it is yours, without citing that I got this information from this author or from this researcher. That is what is termed plagiarism, and as I said, it's simply known as academic theft. Citing someone's recommendation, for example, or procedure as your own. If you do that, it can affect you immensely as a student. And that is why lately we have what we call the Turnitin software that the University of Ghana uses to check for plagiarism. So for example, if I give you an assignment, I'll put it online on Sakai, and I'll ask you to submit the assignment on Sakai. And I set the assignment in such a way that when you submit it, it goes through the Turnitin software that checks for plagiarism. So if you copied from somewhere, it will highlight all the information that you copied. And based on that, I can decide whether you have plagiarized or not. I will encourage you to read more about scientific misconduct. So this brings us to the end of section 10, part 2 and 3, where I've talked about ethical guidelines governing the use of animal subjects in research. And I've also briefly talked about scientific misconduct.